Gagged for 3 years by her stepfather, a Lakota chief removed the cloth and waited to hear her. The fire had burned down to red coals before I noticed she hadn't made a sound in 4 hours. Not sleeping, she was sitting up, back straight, on the far side of the tipi, watching the coals the way a person watches something that might move. I'd seen that kind of stillness before, in horses that had been struck too many times, in warriors who'd ridden back from a bad fight and needed 3 days before the eyes came back to them. Her name was Nora Hale, or that was the name the white trader gave her when he came to me with his hat twisted in his hands and his story falling out in pieces. Said she'd been his stepdaughter for 3 years. Said the man her mother had married, dead 2 winters past, had been the kind of man I have no word for in my language that doesn't also mean something that should be put down. Said she hadn't spoken in 18 months that he could remember, maybe longer. He left her with me because he didn't know what else to do, and because I'd once helped his trading post through a winter when everyone else in that valley had given up on him. I didn't want her there. I had enough to hold together. I was holding a lot by then. My name is Chayton. My father's name and his father's before that, it means falcon in the old tongue, though I never thought of myself that way. Falcons are quick. I had been moving slow for a long time, the kind of slow that isn't rest. The kind that comes from carrying the same weight so long you stop, noticing it's heavy. My wife Ayana had been gone 4 years. Fever the 2nd winter after our son was born. Hawk, we named him Tassunk, little horse, but he'd decided on Hawk himself by the time he could argue about it, was 6 years old and loud enough for 3 children, which is the only reason the camp still had noise in it. I'd done what men do. Worked. Provided. Kept the peace between my band and the whites along the southern ridge, which was a job that required more patience than fighting and more diplomacy than I'd ever wanted to learn. I was respected. People brought me their problems at sunrise and sometimes didn't leave until after dark. My council tent was never empty. But my own tipi was quiet. I'd made peace with that, or I'd told myself I had, which is a different thing entirely. The first morning Nora was there, I handed her a bowl of elk stew and she took it without looking up. Ate it like she was doing it out of obligation, not hunger. Then set the bowl down and folded her hands in her lap and went back to whatever place it was she lived in behind her eyes. She had a cloth. I noticed it that first morning, tucked into the sash at her waist, a strip of dirty white cotton folded small. I didn't ask about it then. Later I would understand. Her stepfather had gagged her with it when she spoke too much, too loud at the wrong times in the wrong tone, and after long enough she stopped waiting for him to reach for it. She just stayed quiet. Kept the cloth with her, I think, because putting it down felt like a lie. She was 23 years old. She had dark eyes and a scar below her left ear that she kept covered with her hair, and hands that were rougher than they should have been. I gave her a space in my tipi because it was the most protected place in camp, and because putting her somewhere else would have meant explaining her to people who would have more questions than she had answers for. I told my son she was a guest, and that guests were not to be bothered. Hawk stared at her for 1 full minute when he met her, then said, very seriously, that she could use his clay horse if she wanted, and set it next to her sleeping mat. She looked at it for a long time, didn't touch it, but she didn't move it either. I noticed things, that's what I had been doing for years. You lead a band of people through hard winters and tense borders, you learn to watch. She flinched at quick movements. She pulled inward if my voice rose above a certain level. She tracked exits. She sat with her back to walls or hides, never to open space. She ate carefully, like she expected the food to be taken back. I didn't comment on any of it. Didn't try to coax her. Didn't summon the camp's medicine woman and tell her to fix the white woman living in my tipi. I just let her be where she was and did the work I had always done and kept the fire going and made sure there was food. 2 weeks passed that way. The 3rd week, Hawk got into a wasp nest near the creek and came back to camp screaming at a volume that I believe reached the next ridge. He had 3 stings on his left arm and was absolutely certain he was dying, which he explained in detail to anyone who would stand still long enough. I cleaned the stings and told him he would survive, and he told me that was easy for me to say because I wasn't the one who had been stung, and I told him that was fair. He fell asleep with his arm across my knee, still complaining, trailing off into sleep the way children do, and when I looked up, Nora was watching us from across the fire. Not watching the door, not watching the shadows, watching my son sleep on my knee with his mouth open. I didn't make anything of it, just watched the fire. But something had moved. A few days after that I was working a piece of harness leather outside the tipi, the kind of work that takes your hands but not your mind, and she came and sat nearby. Not close. 6 feet maybe. She had the cloth in her lap and she was working the edge of it between her thumb and finger, which I'd noticed she did when she was thinking. I kept working the leather. She picked up a small stick and started turning it in her fingers, set it down, picked up a pebble, set that down too. I said in English, my English was better than I usually let on, I said, "You don't have to talk." She looked at me sideways. I said, "You don't have to be quiet either." She looked back at the ground. I said, "I'm not keeping track." And that was all I said. I finished the harness and went inside. The next morning she was up before me, which had never happened, and there was water heating over the rekindled fire, and a cloth laid out with dried berries from the pack she'd kept tucked under her sleeping mat. She'd made breakfast. She'd gotten up in the dark and rebuilt a fire she'd never tended and made food for 2, and she was sitting there with her hands folded, waiting. I sat down, she ate, we did not speak. It was the best breakfast I'd had in 4 years, and I could not have told you why. Things shifted after that. Slow, the way rivers shift in dry seasons. You don't see it happening, but you look one morning and the bank is different. She started moving through camp instead of staying close to the tipi. My people watched her with the particular careful attention of people who have been told not to stare. Old Maka, who had been the closest thing I had to an aunt since I was 10 years old, watched Nora for 3 days and then handed her a piece of beadwork to finish and walked away without a word, which was, for Maka, the equivalent of a formal welcome. Nora sat and worked the beading with more patience and steadiness than most people I knew. Didn't rush. Didn't flinch when other women came to sit nearby. When one of the younger women, Chumani, showed her a different knot with the sinew, Nora watched her hands closely and then nodded and tried it, and when she got it right the first time, Chumani said something approving in Lakota, and Nora's face did something I hadn't seen it do before. Not quite a smile, an unlocking. The muscles around her eyes let go of something they'd been holding. I turned away before she caught me looking. The month moved into the cold. We were not at war with anyone that season, which was rarer than it should have been, and I had time, more than I usually let myself take, to notice things that weren't my responsibility. I noticed that Nora had started sleeping without curling inward, that she'd stopped tracking exits, that she still kept the cloth but carried it differently, more in the bottom of her sash now, less in her hand. One night I came back from a long meeting with 2 of my subchiefs, a dispute about grazing ground that had taken 3 hours to resolve, and the tipi was dark except for the banked fire, and Hawk was asleep and Nora was sitting up, not watching the door, not watching the shadows, just sitting. And she looked at me when I came in. Not away from me, at me. I stopped. She said, and it was the first time I'd heard her voice, and it was low and a little rough, like something that had been stored and was being taken back out. She said, "Long night." 2 words flat. Not a question, not a comfort, just an acknowledgement. I said yes. She nodded, lay down, pulled the blanket up. I stood there for a moment, and I'm not too proud to say it hit me somewhere I hadn't expected. Something warm and hard at the same time, right in the chest. 2 words from a woman who hadn't spoken in a year and a half, and she'd said them to me. Chosen to say them to me. It shouldn't have been as big as it was. I sat down by the fire and didn't sleep for a while. After that she spoke in small amounts, a word here, a sentence there, always matter of fact, always to the point. She said things that were true and didn't waste words making them softer than they were. She told me once that the stew needed more salt, which it did, and I would have gone another month not saying so. She told Hawk when he was trying to get out of his evening duties that she'd seen him do them faster and he wasn't fooling anyone. Hawk looked stunned. Then he did his duties. She asked me once out of nowhere while I was sharpening a knife what the word was in Lakota for the color the hills when at dusk. I told her. She repeated it back carefully, getting the vowel sound just wrong enough that I corrected her, and she tried again and had it. She wrote nothing down, just held it. A week later I heard her say it to Chumani while they were pointing at the horizon. I don't know what I was feeling then. I knew what I wasn't feeling. I hadn't felt it in 4 years, and its absence had become normal, and then I had forgotten what normal even was. But sitting there with the whetstone in my hand, listening to that word come out of her mouth in the right shape, I thought, oh. Just that, oh. Winter came hard that year. Snow in the passes 3 weeks early, and a hunting party that came back with less than we needed and long fires, and the particular cold that gets inside a camp when people are worried. I was busy in the way I was always busy when things were difficult, which meant I was visible to everyone and alone in my own head, making decisions, weighing what I had against what was needed. Not complaining because the chief's complaints become everyone's fears, which is a weight I'd been carrying so long the shape of it had molded to my shoulders. There was a night in the worst week of that cold, snow against the hides, wind that pushed through every gap. My 2 subchiefs and 3 of the elder women and I had been talking for 4 hours about the grain cache and whether we had enough to last, and the answer was that maybe we did if nothing else went wrong, which meant we didn't really have enough. And the meeting broke and people went to their fires and I went to mine. Hawk was asleep, pressed close to the coals the way he did in hard cold. Nora was awake. She had both blankets over her and she'd kept Hawk's small fire stoked better than I'd left it. She looked at me when I came in and I must have looked as worn down as I felt because she didn't say anything, just moved over and made room at the fire. I sat down. She put a cup of something hot into my hands, something she'd made from dried bark and a root maca had given her, nothing fancy but warm and slightly bitter and exactly right. I drank it. She sat next to me, not pressed against me, but close enough that I could feel the warmth of her. I said, we might have a hard February. She said, I know. I said, I'm not sure what I'm going to do about it. There was a pause and then she said, you'll figure it out. Not soft, not a comfort exactly. The way you'd say something you'd actually thought about. Matter of fact. Like it had not occurred to her to doubt it and she was just confirming what she'd already decided was true. I don't know how long we sat there. Long enough that the fire needed tending and she tended it without getting up from beside me, just reaching and settled back. My hands had stopped being cold. The weight on my shoulders was still there, but it felt distributed differently somehow, like there were 2 people carrying it. I said after a while, you said more tonight than usual. She said, you looked like you needed it. She was looking at the fire, her profile in the firelight, the scar below her ear, her hands around her own cup still and steady. I said, what I needed was someone to think I could manage. She turned and looked at me, straight at me. She said, I know that too. There was something in the way she said it that made me understand. She meant more than the winter food question. She meant the last several months. She meant the thing I'd been doing for 4 years, which was holding everyone up while standing in a place that was, underneath, quite hollow. She'd seen it. I don't know when, maybe from the beginning. Maybe from the 2nd week when she was watching my son sleep on my knee. But she'd seen it and she'd decided something about it and she was telling me now. I stayed quiet. I'm not always sure what to do with being seen. I'd been the one who saw for so long. It takes some getting used to coming the other way. She put her hand over mine, just placed it there, her palm over the back of my hand on the ground between us. I turned my hand over, held it. We sat that way until the fire burned low again. She fell asleep leaning against my shoulder, not heavy, just there, her breath even and slow, the first time I'd heard her sleeping that way since she'd come, without the tight, shallow sounds of someone staying ready in case. Just sleeping, trusting. Hawk's clay horse was still next to her sleeping mat, right where it had been since the third day. February was hard. It was hard the way I'd expected and hard in a couple of ways I hadn't, but we made it through. Hunting improved in the third week, and a trade came through from the eastern band that helped with the gap, and by the end of the month the worst was behind us. I'd made decisions I had to live with and decisions I was glad of and a few I was still arguing with myself about, but the camp was whole. Through all of it, Nora was there. Not in the way of standing behind me or making speeches, nothing like that. In the way of a person who's decided something and means it. When a young mother in camp was sick and Maka needed help through the night, Nora sat with her until morning and didn't make anything of it. When Hawk's wolf dog had a bad cut from a wire that needed cleaning twice a day, Nora did it without being asked, even when the dog didn't want to cooperate, which was every time. When I came back from particularly hard days and the tippy was quiet, there was always evidence she'd thought about me being there, the fire the right size, something to eat, nothing demanding. Not servitude, not small cowering kindness. It was the generosity of someone who was choosing to be generous. There's a difference and it matters, and I knew the difference. She spoke more. She spoke slowly and carefully, like someone who understood the weight of words better than most people do, and she didn't spend them on things that didn't need saying. She had a dry way of observing things that caught me off guard sometimes. Just a flat, true sentence about something I'd been dancing around, and I'd end up laughing, which I hadn't done much of. She asked questions about things I knew and listened when I answered. She told me, piece by piece, about where she'd come from, a farm in Missouri, a mother who was soft and unlucky with men, the stepfather who'd come when she was 19, and by 20 had her so reduced she couldn't remember what she'd been before. She told me these things matter-of-factly, not asking for anything in return, just putting the truth down somewhere it could be known. I told her things I hadn't told most people, about Ayana, about the years after, about how you can grieve so long that the grief calcifies and becomes part of the structure and you stop thinking of it as grief and start thinking of it as just who you are. She listened. She didn't try to fix it or frame it. She just let it be what it was. One afternoon in March, the snow pulling back from the southern slopes and the first dry ground showing in patches, she came to where I was working near the horses and stood beside me for a minute. Then she reached into her sash and took out the cloth. She held it out. I looked at it in her hand. She said, "I want to put this down somewhere, I'm not carrying it." I took it from her, folded it smaller, looked at her. She said, "I don't know what that means exactly. I'm still figuring that out." I said, "That's all right." I held the cloth. She stood there. Her hands were free and she didn't seem to know where to put them for a second, and then she put them in her own pockets, and something settled in her posture that I hadn't realized had been unsettled. I said, "You don't have to know what it means yet." She nodded. She said, "I know," she said. "I just knew it was time to give it to you." She went back to camp. I stayed with the horses. I turned the cloth over in my hands. Dirty white cotton, frayed at one end, worn smooth where her thumb had worked it for months. I stood there in the March cold with the horses blowing steam beside me and the mud soft under my boots, and I thought about the last 4 years. The hollow place. The work and the weight and the absence of anything that was mine alone, not the bands, not the camps, not the memory of what I'd had. And I thought about a woman who'd come to me with 3 years of silence behind her and no voice left, and somehow in the months since had gotten them both back and had pointed them at me. Not because I'd rescued her, though maybe I'd kept her safe when she needed it, but because she decided I was worth pointing herself toward. Had decided that quietly and on her own, and without needing me to ask or coax or be anything other than what I was. That landed somewhere. I went back to the tipi. She was inside, working on a piece of leather. Maka had been teaching her tanning, which Nora had taken to with the same patience she brought to everything. She looked up when I came in. I sat across from her. I said, "I want to ask you something." She waited. I said, "When you came here, you had nothing left, and you built yourself back up right here in this place. You could have taken that and gone somewhere else. Nobody would have said you owed anything." She kept looking at me, not anxious, just listening. I said, "Why are you still here?" She was quiet for long enough that I thought she was going to say it was simpler than I'd made it, the winter, the familiarity, nowhere better to go. Practical answers. True ones, maybe. Then she said, "Because you waited." I said, "Waited?" She said, "You waited for me to find my voice again. You didn't push, didn't coax, didn't decide what I was going to be." She paused. "You just kept the fire and made room." Another pause. "That is not as small a thing as it sounds." I didn't say anything. She said, "And because you need somebody in your corner, and you won't ask for it, and I decided I was going to be that person." Just like that, matter of fact, as though she'd thought it through carefully and arrived at a conclusion and was stating the conclusion. I looked at her hands on the leather, the roughness of them, the steadiness. I said, "I'm not an easy man." She said, "I know that." I said, "I've been running this band for 11 years, and the whole of it lives in my head, and I don't always know how to put it down." She said, "I know that too." She looked at me directly. She said, "Chayton, I've been watching you hold everyone up for 4 months. I know what I'm saying." I reached across the space between us, put my hand against her face, her jaw, the scar, the hair tucked behind her ear. She let me. She put her hand up and held my wrist, not holding me back, just holding on. Her eyes didn't close. She looked straight at me, clear. She said, soft, and I heard in it all the months of her voice coming back, all the words she'd chosen to give me and no one else. She said, "Let me." Hawk came crashing in approximately 4 minutes later, loudly announcing that old Maka's cook fire had gotten out of hand, and everyone was standing around talking about it. And did we have water? And also he was very hungry. The moment broke the way moments do when there is a child in the camp, which is completely and without mercy. Nora looked at him and said, very calmly, that the water was in the same place it always was, and that supper would be ready when it was ready, and that he could go be useful to Maka in the meantime. Hawk looked at her, looked at me, looked back at her. He grabbed the water and went. I watched him go. Then I looked back at Nora and she was already looking at me, and her face did that thing, not quite a smile, but the unlocking, wider now than I'd ever seen it. The spring came the way springs come up on the plains, fast, then all at once, the grass going from brown to green in what seems like a week, the creek loud, the horses restless, everything in the world loud and new and insisting on itself. There was a morning in late April, the ground soft and the air smelling of wet earth, when I came out before sunrise and Nora was already there, sitting outside the tipi, just sitting, looking at the hills. I sat beside her. She said, without turning, "Tell me the Lakota word for what this looks like." I told her. She said it back, got it right. The hills went from gray to gold as the sun hit them. Somewhere in camp a child was already awake and making himself known about it. One of the horses shook its mane. The day was starting the way days start, with everything ordinary and everything alive. Her shoulder was against mine. She had both hands in her lap, empty and open. I had been the one holding things up for so long. The one holding the weight, holding the silence, holding the space for everyone who needed it. Having someone hold space for me in return, I had forgotten that was possible. I had decided, somewhere along the years, that it wasn't part of what I got. That the job was the job and there was honor in it, and that was enough. And maybe it was enough. Maybe I'd have gone on thinking so. But there she was, her shoulder against mine, her voice in my ear with the language of my people in it, giving it back to me. Choosing this hillside and this morning and this man beside her, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she had looked at what I was and decided. That is not a small thing, I know that now. I did not always know it. The sun came full up over the eastern ridge and she turned and looked at me, the way she'd started doing, straight at me, nothing shaded, nothing held back. The woman who had been made silent looking at me like I was worth all of her words. I thought of the cloth, still folded in my pocket. I thought, this is what it is to be seen. I had the whole day's work ahead of me, the band to lead, the decisions to make. The same weight, the same responsibility, the same territory I'd been navigating for 11 years. But there was this morning first. And she was in it. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything.